Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. We're going to wait one more minute before we get started in case there's any stragglers here. Okay. So again, welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. We'll provide a high-level overview of the changes between R2 2013 and R2V3, as well as an overview of the certification process for new clients or new registrations. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have an agenda on the screen. Very briefly, we'll talk about Perry Johnson Registrars, who we are, what we do, cover some of the benefits of certification to the R2 standard, cover transition timeline details, as well as some of the key changes associated with the standard revision. We'll close with an overview of the certification process, and I'll allow time for questions at the end. You can go ahead and type those questions in the chat field or question field at any point, but I will be saving those for the end. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on PJR's website, as well as a copy of the slides. Those will be available in the next couple of days. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified clients around the globe. This is not an all-inclusive list, but gives an idea of our global presence as a certification body. We are accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards, including R2V3, which is the subject for today's webinar. Benefits of certification to R2 include, but are not limited to, a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics and components, improving the organization's EHS performance, representing a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements, driving improvements or increases in management commitment as well as employee engagement, providing a competitive advantage if you are, for example, competing for a bid and you hold a certification such as R2 that a competitor does not hold, it can provide a competitive advantage. Could also improve public image, being able to advertise certification to R2. Besides the competitive advantage, there could be other potential financial benefits in some industries with some standard, some certification standards. You may see a reduction in insurance premiums, for example. Another benefit could be achieving strategic objectives that the organization or their corporate structure may hold, as well as potentially achieving stakeholder requirements. The R2 standard is also able to be integrated with other business management systems. I have some information here to share about the transition timeline for R2V3, which you're likely already aware of. This was published some time ago. So the R2V3 standard was published in 2020. You can get a copy from CERI's website. You can also get a copy of the rec, which we'll talk more about shortly, and the R2V3 transition plan, also known as CERI Code of Practices Advisory 22. CERI has also issued a revised version of the Code of Practices, also accessible through CERI's website. We can expect a R2 guidance document in the future as well. R2V3 transition audits, again, so we're focusing here first on the transition process for clients who are certified to R2 2013 and will be transitioning their certificate to R2V3. That's what we're discussing now. Towards the end of the presentation, we will talk about, on the other hand, new registrations. So not a transition, but pursuing initial certification or initial registration to R2V3 rather than transitioning an existing, active, valid, current, whatever you want to call it, R2 2013 certificate to R2V3 instead. So the R2V3 transition audits, where you are upgrading from R2 2013 to R2V3 during a transition audit, these can be conducted up to 50% via virtual or remote auditing techniques. So CIRI Advisory 22 allows the R2V3 transition audit to be up to 50% virtual. The transition timeline is staggered. It's based on the R2 2013 certificate expiration date to try and avoid facilities all transitioning at once. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. In accordance with CIRI Advisory 22, PGR issued their own transition plan. We recommend that your transition audit takes place by March 30th of 2023 to avoid a lapse in certification. If your audit is held closer to the deadline, we cannot guarantee no lapse in certification. We, along with the other certification bodies, are required to achieve accreditation to R2V3 before we can issue accredited certs. And as I mentioned on a previous slide, PGR has achieved accreditation. In most cases with this early 2023 deadline, our clients should plan to transition in 2022 if they're not required to transition sooner to avoid a lapse in certification, but certainly you're allowed to wait until closer to the deadline should you choose to do so. So the transition details specifically, as I mentioned, relate to certification expiration dates. We are already beyond the deadline for initial registration, so we're not offering any new certificates to R2 2013. They all have to be to R2V3 now. If you're having a stage 1 or a stage 2 audit, it's automatically being conducted to R2V3. If you have an existing R2 2013 certificate that expires sometime this calendar year, you are allowed to recertify to R2 2013. You have to meet certain criteria listed here on this slide, but you are allowed to recertify to R2 2013 one more time. Otherwise, if your certificate expires after the end of this year, so June 1st, 2022, you have to transition at or before your next recertification audit based on the overall deadline to transition. So keep this date in mind as well. Sorry about that. You can transition during any audit within your cycle. It doesn't have to be a recert audit. You can transition during a surveillance audit as well. However, the R2V3 transition audit time will be calculated as equivalent to a registration audit. So a stage 1 plus a stage 2. This is required by the CIRI Advisory 22, and it is to allow the auditor to be able to cover all of the core requirements and all applicable process requirements. So it's a full system audit. It also restarts the 3-year certification cycle for R2V3. If you choose to adjust your audit cycle, it could be your recertification for all of your standards, but that is not required. Again, the overall deadline to transition is June 30th of 2023. So if you have not been issued an R2V3 certificate by that date, your R2 2013 certificate will be withdrawn. I have the same information on a timeline. Sometimes a visual representation is helpful. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on why the standard was revised. It's been out for quite some time now, and Standards are often revised for similar reasons. Again, a recording of the webinar and copies of the slides will be available on PJR's website. You can also review some of these details on your own time. But at a high level, it takes into account series lessons learned over the years, the R2 Technical Advisory Committee, feedback, public comments from a variety of sources, the need to reflect a wide variety of organizations or a large amount of diversity within the recycling industry to reinforce effective implementation of the requirements within the standard, making sure that the intent of the standard is achieved. So if something was unclear or inconsistently implemented, the language was strengthened or clarified in R2V3. It's also clarified to prevent confusion, make it easier to translate, things like that. This is a very high level overview of the changes. This is not a SERI training course. So we're going to cover this stuff very briefly, just again, a high level overview, trying to give our clients an idea of what some of those key changes are to get the ball rolling as they prepare to transition. This does not replace formal SERI training for your internal auditor or anything like that. Just wanted to clarify that before we dig into the R2V3 changes themselves. So it's important to note that no changes have been made to the intent of the standard. The verbiage and the structure has changed, but the intent has not. As you can see by this screenshot of the table of contents, the standard is divided in a different way. It's formatted differently. We see that the standard is divided into 10 core requirements and also process requirements or the appendices. So the process requirements are found within the appendices, and while all the core requirements will apply to all the R2 facilities, only the applicable process requirements will be relevant. So it depends on the scope and the types of processing and the materials to identify which appendices apply. There's a greater emphasis on reuse in R2V3. It's more prescriptive in certain areas such as data security, testing, and repair processes. I mentioned that some of the requirements have been clarified. You can see just by this table of contents that the structure of the standard is different. So there are no longer 13 provisions, but 10 core requirements and the 6 appendices. Another key change is the creation of the REC or the R2 Equipment Categorization Document, which we'll talk very briefly about a little further on. I mentioned that there are no changes to the intent of the standard. The introduction is very similar. You do see references to the REC here in the introduction. That would be the key change here. You can download a copy from SERI's website. The REC is not auditable, but it is to be used in conjunction with the standard. It provides an outline of requirements for evaluation of electronic equipment and components, as well as categories for those equipment and components based on their condition. The organization is required to either incorporate the categories in the REC exactly, or provide a cross-reference between the requirements in the REC and the R2 facilities categories that they utilize. No significant changes in regards to the R2 certification section because again, the intent is unchanged. You'll note some changes to the certificates, what is required to be included in the certificates, and that's spelled out in the Code of Practices as well. Many new terms, some changed terminology, some removed terminology. So you'll want to get familiar with these as well. Digging into the core requirements, again, at a very high level, core requirement 1 covers scope. This specifies what the certification needs to include. You'll see some changes here, including external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification, if there are any. It will have to include all the core requirements and all the applicable process requirements given the facility's scope. Services outside of the facility but still related to their operations may include offsite collection, mobile data destruction, services performed at a customer site, etc., still relevant and required to be included in the scope. I mentioned some changes to what needs to be reflected on the certificate itself. You'll see the scope as always. You'll now see the process requirements that are applicable. If there are allowances added in the future, you'll see them on the certificate. You'll also see all legal names and legal entities associated with the certifiable activities operating at or in conjunction with the R2 facility, also listed on the certificate. R2 facilities will be required to publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of all other locations that are not certified to R2, are owned and or operated by the R2 facility, and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So this is a new change, and this adds to the need to clearly communicate or clearly advertise your certification when you have more than one facility that is not certified to R2. If you have multiple locations and they're not all certified, the need to be very clear about how those certifications apply, so there isn't any misleading information available to the public as to the certification status for your locations. To be eligible for R2, an organization can't have been identified within the last 2 years to be fraudulently marketing their R2 certification or participating in illegal activities. No significant changes to core requirement 2. This is in regards to the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. So again, the intent of the standard is the same. Reuse is the first choice, as it has always been. Core requirement 3 covers EHS management systems, still recognizes ISO 45001 and OSAS 18001 in this time of transition. Requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. It provides examples, and industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements kick in above and beyond that for higher risk activities such as materials recovery. The section also specifies the minimum accommodations required on behalf of workers. You can find that in Core Requirement 3. Core Requirement 4 covers legal and other requirements. It includes the requirement to document applicable legal requirements, including export, transit, and import. R2 controlled streams is a new term that you'll want to get familiar with as well. So this includes R2 controlled streams, including shipments made by downstream vendors to final disposition or the first R2 facility. R2 facilities are required to notify their CB if they get a notice of violation requiring follow-up or action on their part. We need to be notified within at least or within 30 days. The standard also requires corrective action be taken promptly to address any compliance violations. Child enforced labor is prohibited. Prison labor is also prohibited unless certain criteria are met, and there are details for a non-discrimination policy included in Core Requirement 4. Core Requirement 5 covers tracking throughput. This section requires a summary report be maintained for all transactions inbound and outbound, controlled by the R2 facility, whether through physical possession, title, or other contractual agreement where you're taking control of those materials. The record contents need to be accurate. They need to contain dates and detailed descriptions. And it's also important within Core Requirement 5 that total inventory levels be maintained below the limits required to maintain conformity with any applicable legal requirements, the R2 facility's closure plan, and any other relevant requirements that would relate to inventory levels or maximum storage quantities. R2 controlled streams, again, we see this term, you'll want to get familiar with the definition. R2 controlled streams cannot be stored if they have a negative value for more than 1 year. There are a couple exceptions spelled out here and in the standard, components that have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C test and repair. So maybe parts for reuse if you've tested them and you're storing them to use them to refurbish items in the future. Or where permissible, items are stored beyond the time frame due to a lack of response from the relevant governing authority. So if you're trying to export something, you submitted your application or authorization paperwork by the deadline and they just haven't gotten back to you with that approval yet. Core Requirement 6 covers sorting, categorization, and processing. This section is really significantly restructured. There's a lot of references to the rec in this section. Core Requirement 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing the controlled and processed materials with prescriptive subject matter to be included. All materials are to be managed and further processed as an R2 controlled stream per standard requirements, unless it meets certain exceptions as well. All equipment or components need to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the rec. Data evaluations are to include any connected user accounts and services. Core Requirement 6 requires the R2 facility to control any equipment or components that may contain data per Core Requirement 7. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused, sold, or donated per written agreements are still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7, which is related to data, and Appendix E, materials recovery. Identification requirements for equipment and components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse are also found in Core Requirement 6, and they reference the applicable appendices as relevant. Specific requirements for electronics or components that have been evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream, again, per the rec, are included in Core Requirement 6. This might include things like handling them separately from the R2 controlled streams, being able to justify classifying them as an unrestricted stream, tracking records to be maintained, including any reason for return. There are specific requirements for transferring functioning products, excuse me, that have been demonstrated to be functional per the rec. Those are found in Core Requirement 6. I've listed some examples here. Physical labels are not necessarily required. You can also use barcodes or other methods of identification or tracking. We don't see any significant changes to the collectible and specialty electronic pieces. As I mentioned, Core Requirement 7 covers data security. It requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address prescriptive or prescribed subjects within the standard. Again, I've included some examples here, but this is really a high-level summary, and you'll want to refer directly to the standard and the SERI training materials or website for further clarification. Requirements for a written data security policy are included in Core Requirement 7. including the need to assign a competent data protection representative. The risk of theft and unauthorized access needs to be considered within the R2 facility's security program as well. Core Requirement 7 has requirements for different levels of security permissions for controlled access, relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of the data managed, and the applicable legal and other requirements, all of which need to be authorized by the data protection representative. It also requires written acknowledgements be maintained for those granted security authorization, addressing their individual responsibility to prevent data releases, report theft, or data breaches, things of that nature. There's also a requirement for an incident response procedure for the investigation of potential or actual breaches of data and/or security. You also need to notify regulators, suppliers, interested parties, etc. as relevant. Core Requirement 7 requires a defined process to demonstrate that destruction processes are 100% effective. Those are some of the key changes here. We also see that devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor per a written contract if they've been verified according to Appendix A, Downstream Recycling Chain Appendix. And this is in regards to if the data sanitization or destruction is not being conducted by the R2 facility. So in order for the sanitization and/or the destruction to be outsourced to a downstream vendor, they need to be vetted against the specific requirements in Appendix A. Core Requirement 7 also requires at least annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the data sanitization processes, and those need to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. Core Requirement 7 also requires a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, such as changes to their downstream vendors, processing their material, and security breaches. Core Requirement 8 covers focus materials. There are requirements to demonstrate the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities for processing the focus materials. It requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when you're not the final point of processing or end of life tier, final disposition, goes by many terms. And this is found in Appendix A as well. This needs to go all the way through final disposition or the first R2 certified tier. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury would be managed under Core Requirement 2, Hierarchy of Responsible Management Strategies, along with print cartridges. In R2V3, even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials. That's another change. Core Requirement 9 focuses on the facility requirements. Indoor processing is required, except in instances where outdoor operations have been assessed for risk and the release potentials have been controlled. Indoor storage and labeling is also required for R2 controlled streams, with the exception of items intended for outdoor use. Insurance needs to be appropriate given the risk, size, and scope of operations. The closure plan needs to include the appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under their control. In R2V3, there is an exception to the need to hold a financial instrument if an organization meets all three of these requirements. Total closure costs need to be less than $10,000. The building needs to be less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility can never have accepted equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. Core Requirement 10 covers transport. the need to package for transportation securely in accordance with core requirements 7 and 4. If you're transporting data containing equipment or components, there are additional requirements as well, such as utilizing packaging controls to secure the contents of the packages. Core requirement 10 requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, and declarations in compliance with any applicable regulatory requirements. As I mentioned, there are 10 core requirements, and then we get into the process requirements, or the appendices, which would be in the second half of the standard. Appendix A covers downstream recycling chain. This is where we see the requirements for the FM plan, the downstream due diligence, import-export compliance evidence, the tracking, and the transparent communication in regards to the recycling chain. This is also where we see the ability to register the portion of the downstream recycling chain that you manage with SERI. For an R2V3 certified downstream vendor, verification of a valid R2V3 certificate will satisfy due diligence requirements. This includes making sure the certificate is active and valid, that the scope of certification is confirmed with the types of materials being sent and processed, that all the process requirements are included as appropriate, things like that. For a non-R2V3 certified downstream vendor, so just to be clear, if it's an R2 2013 certified downstream vendor, they are falling into this second category of being non-R2. This is only recognizing the R2V3 certification. We see a lot of confusion on that point. So if you're using a non-R2V3 certified downstream vendor, there aren't significant changes to the due diligence requirements. You obviously see updated references since the structure of the standard, the numbering of the sections, and the appendices is different, but no significant changes to the content. There are additional due diligence requirements for the outsourcing of data sanitization or destruction. Again, we mentioned that earlier. So that'll be in Appendix A 8D. Appendix B covers data sanitization. This lists all the additional requirements above and beyond core requirement 7. Things like traceability, training, competency, security controls, physical destruction methodologies, retention of video recordings for security purposes, things like that. Appendix C covers test and repair. One of the key things to note about Appendix C is that it also requires a quality management system certification. At this time, it recognizes ISO 9001 or RIOS for that purpose. So in addition to the ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 certificate or the RIOS certificate required to meet the core requirement 3 EHS system requirements, you would also need a quality management system certification. If you already have RIOS, you're covered. If you have ISO 14001 and 45001 instead, you would need to add ISO 9001. It also requires an R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria to be included, the need to process materials within 1 year of receipt, and the need for test result records to be maintained for all functionalities with unique identifiers. Appendix D covers specialty electronics reuse. If you have Appendix D, you also are required to have Appendix C, which means you would also need that quality management system certification. Appendix D details different criteria and verifications required in lieu of testing, because this is where we see that the R2 facility lacks the technical capability to test these specialty units or devices. There are also requirements depending on whether the specialty electronics pass or fail those verifications. If they have been verified, they can be stored indefinitely, as long as they continue to have positive resale value and or a reuse market. Appendix E covers materials recovery. In addition to the requirements in the EHS section of the standard, Appendix E has further hazard and risk requirements for these higher risk activities, or the materials recovery related activities. So additional risk assessments, training, maintenance, operational controls, pollution liability coverage. There are a couple of differences here. And Appendix F, the last appendix, covers brokering. It applies to both the sourcing and control of equipment directly to a downstream vendor, as well as through a broker. So whether they take physical possession or not, they can still apply this Appendix F. They are required to make sure all the R2 requirements are being met for those R2 controlled streams either way. Downstream vendors need to be included and managed per Appendix A. This does not let brokers off the hook for the downstream due diligence. It also requires the certified quality management system for the broker appendix. The brokering facility is responsible for core requirement 4, utilizing the REC, managing the transport of the controlled streams through the recycling chain, data security, physical security, core requirement 10, tracking for core requirement 5, core requirement 10, packaging requirements. If the broker does not have a facility that takes physical possession of the material, so if R2 controlled streams never pass through the broker's facility, we can skip, I don't want to say exclude because there are no exclusions, but it satisfies the requirements of core requirement 3 and core requirement 9. Going to talk just very briefly about the REC as well, just as an introduction. Again, not a formal CRE training by any means. Excuse me. The REC, or the R2 equipment categorization document, represents a framework for evaluating the electronic equipment, components, and materials, and categorizing their R2 status throughout each step of the R2 process. There are categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, and data sanitization status to be used for functional products, collectible, and specialty electronics post-processing. There are assigned statuses, or the ability to accept the assigned status from another R2V3 facility rather than conduct the testing again. While R2V3 prefers the R2 facility utilize the exact categories in the REC, as I mentioned, you're also able to have a cross-reference. Not all categories in the REC will apply to all R2 facilities. Only applicable categories should be utilized, and the categories do not replace descriptions required for contracts, regulatory compliance, etc. We're not going to go through the REC contents in great detail. I have the slides here, as I mentioned. Just going to go through these really quickly. You'll want to review the REC in more detail. There are the R2 processing categories. There's an R2 applicability table, table 1, that can be helpful in understanding where the material goes next, or where to go from here. There's a data sanitization status table. There are functioning product categories, including cosmetic descriptions, product functionality descriptions. There's a blank specific equipment categorization section in case Siri decides to use that in the future. Appendix A of the rec has enhanced cosmetic category information. Appendix B links the functioning and cosmetic categories. Again, that was just a very high-level overview of the rec. I want to mention a couple other changes that coincide with the release of R2V3 that affect our R2V3 clients. So the R2 Code of Practices contains requirements for client organizations as well as certification bodies like PJR. And some of those key changes, again, trickle down to our clients. There is a need for a contract review before a stage 1 or an R2V3 transition audit to ensure eligibility with all of the new requirements in the Code of Practices. So for PJR, we call this the contract validation, and this will take place prior to your stage 1 if you're a new registration, or prior to your R2V3 transition audit if you are an existing client. This is off-site, this isn't an on-site audit or anything like that. There are changes to the certification structure for multiple facilities or locations. You can find that in the Code of Practice as well, so that a certification scheme can be applied. R2V3 allows one surveillance audit to be conducted virtually per audit cycle. It requires evidence of correction for both minor and major NCRs within a specified time frame to avoid suspension of certification. It also requires revisits for all minor and major NCRs written against the R2V3 standard. There are no allowances currently in R2V3. Those are some of the key changes. And I also want to note, not only do we need a revisit for all R2V3 NCRs, again, within a specified time frame to avoid suspension of certification, I want to note as well that for PJR's processes, if you have an unpaid balance, such as from your transition audit that would have just occurred, your revisit cannot take place. So in order to make sure you can adhere to the revisit timeline or deadline to not have your certificate suspended, you'll need to make sure you pay your balance from your audit for the revisit to be able to occur within the specified time frame. Okay. I went through all of that really quickly, but I do want to have time for questions if there are any. So before we get to questions, at a high level, we covered the R2V3 changes and we covered the transition requirements for clients who are certified to R2 2013, upgrading to R2V3 or transitioning to R2V3. I also want to cover an overview of the certification process for anyone pursuing initial registration to R2V3 who may not be familiar with the process. One of the first steps is to download a copy of the standard to be able to see for yourself what those requirements are. You'll need to establish EHS documentation to reflect or to meet these standard requirements. You'll conduct training. You'll implement the system requirements throughout the standard and throughout your documentation, including having an internal audit, conduct a compliance evaluation, and conduct a management review based on or after the internal audit takes place so that the results of the internal audit can serve as one of the inputs to the management review. I also want to note that before your stage 1 can proceed, as I mentioned earlier, you'll need to have your contract validation or your contract review activity with PJR. Again, this is not an on-site audit, this is an off-site audit activity where we can verify the requirements in the Code of Practices for that contract review. This is something required by Siri through the Code of Practices, ensure eligibility for R2V3 certification, identify the applicable appendices, and confirm some of that information with the client. I also want to mention that before the stage 1 audit can proceed, you need at least 3 months of processing records and evidence, which also means that you've been putting material through your processes. You've been receiving or testing or performing data sanitization, whatever the case may be. This is a prerequisite for the audit, the stage 1 audit as well. After successfully completing the contract validation, you will have your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, which we'll talk more about in a moment. You'll have to address the nonconformities that result from those audits. Again, I mentioned earlier that R2V3 requires closure of all the nonconformities. It also requires revisits for any R2V3 nonconformities, with the exception of stage 1 audits. Once all of those are closed and the package is reviewed internally, you can be issued a R2V3 certificate, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. The stage 1, stage 2 audits, though, I want to talk a little bit more about. The contract validation is typically between a quarter day and a half day offsite. The stage 1 is a documentation review to verify the framework is in place to meet the standard requirements and that your organization is ready for stage 2. If any nonconformities are identified, they need to be resolved before the stage 2 can proceed. This is an R2V3 requirement as well. The stage 2 audit, on the other hand, needs to be completed within 6 months of the stage 1. It's a full system audit, all the core requirements, all the process requirements that are applicable to you. Again, if nonconformities are identified, they need to be resolved, in this case, through a revisit before a certificate can be issued. There's steps in between there. I'm just trying to give a high-level overview. After the nonconformities are accepted by the auditor, the corrective action responses and evidence are accepted by the auditor, the revisit is conducted, the package goes through an internal review, technical review process. Once approved, the certificate draft is created to be approved by the client, and then a final certificate can be issued. So all of those things need to take place if you're transitioning before the deadline. And for an initial certification, it has to be completed within, as I mentioned, the stage 2 has to be completed within 6 months. Once the certificate is issued, it's good for 3 years. So your surveillance audit cycle begins for those subsequent 2 years. You can have annual or semi-annual surveillance audits depending on your contract. Those are shorter partial system audits. They don't cover all of the requirements like the stage 2 does. The 3rd year of the cycle represents the recertification audit, which is very similar to the stage 2. It's a full system audit, results in the issuance of a new certificate, good for 3 years once the package is closed. Okay. If you have any questions and you haven't already typed them, please feel free to do so. But in the meantime, I want to share my contact information. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted via email or the main PJR number. They can put you through to my extension if you have some technical questions you'd like to discuss. Siri is also a great resource for training and technical standard interpretation questions. If you're a new client looking for a quote, I've also included the sales department phone number for them to be able to get that going for you. Okay, let's see if we have any questions. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to just type them into the question field. I don't see any yet, but I'll hang out for another minute or two in case someone is typing. If you have not already scheduled your transition audit or thought about when you'll be ready to transition, I encourage you to discuss that with your scheduler. If your transition audit is coming up, I hope the webinar content is helpful. We're airing these, I want to say every month or so. So feel free to check back. We keep the content updated as we learn new things from Siri or as we're conducting these audits and have some lessons learned that we can share. Just let's see if there's any more questions. Okay, we have a question about the REC. How will the REC apply to failed units moving to disassembly and harvest? So this is something that, again, not spending a lot of time on the REC. I didn't get into a lot of detail with that. Let's go back to what I think would be the most relevant slide here. So the REC provides this applicability table, which I think is helpful, again, in determining where in the process things fall, how the appendices interrelate. So depending on the type of equipment and where it stands in the processing queue or the process, we can see some of the relevant core requirements and appendices for equipment that has been unevaluated that's different than, for example, your question about units that have been evaluated and found to be non-functioning, or maybe the condition is subpar, won't meet the cosmetic grading or functionality requirements for your customers, whatever the case may be. So if it can be repaired, it might go, for example, to Appendix C if you have Appendix C for test and repair. If you don't have Appendix C, perhaps you're outsourcing those repair activities, and then Appendix A may be relevant in terms of downstream due diligence. If it is not able to be repaired and we're talking materials recovery, again, whether you have that appendix or you're outsourcing that activity depends on where we go from there. So if you are applying Appendix E for materials recovery, then you're doing those activities in-house. If you are sending them to a downstream vendor for materials recovery, final disposition, things like that, then Appendix A, as far as how you verify or vet the downstream vendor, would come into play or be relevant. There are a variety of categories for use based on the cosmetic condition and the functionality status. So when you're talking about the REC specifically applying to failed units, it kind of depends on where and why it's falling into that category. So is it going to fail because of cosmetic reasons? You know, there are codes for that. Is it functionality or potentially both? There are codes for that as well. So we can always talk offline if you have specific instances you'd like to discuss. And again, Siri is a valuable resource as well. As an auditor and part of the auditing team, I'm not a consultant, so there are limits to what questions I can answer, but we can always talk offline and I can do my best to point you in the right direction if it's not a question that I can answer myself. Hopefully that gets you started though. We have another question. Do we need to make a designated room for sorting, data wipe, and the room has a door and lock to be separated from other stock? So I can't answer that across the board. Again, I'm on the auditing side, not the consulting side. I will remind you where we talked earlier about some of the data security requirements being dependent on the types of data you're receiving, any requirements that your suppliers might have. Let's see, there are different levels of security. There is the need to control items that contain data when they come through the door, so they're not just, sitting around in plain view, perhaps. So there's a variety of requirements that come into the way you're securing the data, and there's a lot of different ways to meet the requirements in the standard. And again, it varies based on the types of data you might be seeing, applicable requirements you're subject to. There's a lot of variables there. So I can't answer that across the board. Okay. Doesn't look like there are any more questions. So again, feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email back up here. My name is Austin Matthews. I hope your transition goes smoothly if it's coming up. We've got future issues or airings of this webinar, and we'll keep the content updated as we continue to learn some lessons out in the field, auditing and applying the R2V3 standard. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you have a great day.